Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of the Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA and the Resnick Neuropsychiatric Hospital Board of Advisors, I'm excited to welcome you to today's Open Mind program with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, author of the critically acclaimed book, The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Treatment of Trauma. Dr. van der Kolk's groundbreaking book has been on the New York Times nonfiction bestseller list for over 160 weeks and has been published in 36 languages. That could explain why we have over 2,100 people registered for today's program, setting a new Open Mind attendance record. For those of you with us for the first time today, the Open Mind is our free lecture and film series that brings together thought leaders in science and culture for meaningful and relevant discussions about mental health issues. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk is a pioneer clinician, researcher, teacher, and industry leader in the area of post-traumatic stress. He has spent his professional life studying how children and adults adapt to traumatic experiences, translating emerging finds from neuroscience and attachment research to develop and study a range of effective treatments for traumatic stress and developmental trauma. He is the founder of the Trauma Center, now the Trauma Research Foundation in Boston, past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, and professor of psychiatry at Boston University Medical School. He's joining us today from his home in Massachusetts. Dr. Robert Peinuss is a distinguished professor of psychiatry at UCLA, and he will join Dr. van der Kolk in conversation. Dr. Peinuss is an internationally recognized pioneer in the development of psychological first aid for the effects of violence, war, and disasters. He's renowned for his strategies to address the effects of trauma and loss on child and adolescent development. Dr. Peinuss is the co-director of the federally sponsored Duke UCLA National Center for Child Traumatic Stress and the co-developer of the UCLA Focus Program, a family-centered resiliency and skill-based intervention adapted for military families. And he has also helped the United States Department of Education in its response to school shootings. He has received numerous awards, including the 2001 Lifetime Achievement Award from the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. We are honored to have both of these distinguished scholars with us today to share their knowledge and expertise. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping guidelines. Our program today will run for 1 hour and 15 minutes. And due to the extended length, we will not have a Q&A session today. The program is being taped and will be available for viewing on our YouTube channel, which you can find on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. There you will also find a library of videos from past Open Mind programs, a calendar of upcoming events, information about our Friends Scholar Program, our WOW Joint Friends Resnick yearly event, and our Open Mind Film Festival for high school students that will be held on April 28th, 2022. There you will also find a donation page. In the spirit of the holidays and year-end giving, we ask that you please consider supporting our work so that we can continue to bring our Open Mind programs about mental health issues as a free public service. And now, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Bessel van der Kolk and Dr. Robert Peinuss. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Welcome you, Bessel, to UCLA. It's great to have you even by this method. So, Bessel has been a close colleague and friend for more than 3 decades. And it's really an honor for me to share in the discussion of his book, The Body Keeps the Score. Now, I can feel on every page the passion, the perseverance, the compassion, the searching mind, professional dedication, and an openness to his own personal vulnerability that is Bessel through and through. The phenomenal reception worldwide validates the considerable effort at writing this book. I mean, he's done a great service to our field of child and adult trauma, providing such a profound and accessible form. But, you know, for a book so filled with dreadful examples of the underside of human experience, it also invites hope, because you can feel the tremendous capacity and of patient and clinician to work together to build a better future, many times against what seems odds that couldn't be bridged, but which somehow they're able to do. So, you know, I think that we have to keep that in mind, that that's the power of this book as well. So to begin our discussion, let me start with a question about the title of your book, Bezel. Body keeps the score, a very memorable phrase that you've used for years that encapsulates so much of your thinking. I think readers have really appreciated how you illuminate the scoreboard. I mean, you make it visible and then make it accessible to a general audience. No easy thing to do. Can you speak about how entrapped a person becomes by the embodiment of these traumatic life experiences? What you mean by that title?
Well, you know, as William James already knew, our bodies carry our emotions, and emotions really are sensations and the interpretations that we give to sensations. And what we saw, and I feel more and more, is that people are supposed to have ready-made narratives about whatever happened to them, and that's not how it goes. People's minds try to say it's over, time to go on, don't be weak, don't be weepy, but their bodies keep sending them signals of I'm in danger, I can't do anything, I'm collapsed, I'm helpless. So these messages keep coming from the deeper regions of our brain, and we try to ignore it, but that's really where the expression is most of all. And the most recent research shows that even if the PTSD symptoms have ameliorated, the bodily symptoms of PTSD persist, because it's all about the survival brain, a very primitive part of our brain, that whose function it is to make sure that we are okay. And when you get traumatized, it affects your immune system, it affects your endocrinological system, affects your muscular system, your bowel systems. I mean, it affects every system of the body and the mind.
Well, I think that, you know, part of it is that we live with, after these events, with expectations. That's what we learn from them. And the expectations include, as you point out so thoroughly in your book, that the body's primed for certain types of responses. You know, we've been doing the work with children who have been abused and looking at their vascular elasticity responses, which is a way to look at cardiovascular function, but it's partly controlled by the cytokinin system. It's often overlooked that the cytokinin system, as pointed out in study in New Zealand, is really not just there for, as we hear in COVID, for protection against infection. It's actually there evolutionary to help with injury repair. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that children who have been physically abused, for example, are primed for more cytokinin response, reminders, maybe for their whole lives, unless you can intercede. That's an example of how the body is actually really organizing responses, but it's in unison with reminders as well. So I don't want to leave out the other side of reminders.
We won't leave out of mind, but we won't leave out of mind. But since we have traditionally left out of body, that was a good thing to talk about. But an example of what you talk about is that I testified on behalf of numerous men who had been molested by Catholic priests, and I got the old records. And at least half of them had been hospitalized in pediatric wards for physical illnesses, asthma, and for bowel problems, particularly, had the dorsal vagal system that Stephen Porges talks about, that their symptoms were first expressed in their bodies before they even had the language to talk about what had happened to them.
Well, I think your book has been you bring out the complexity of it. I think that's what's important. It's not so simple. And there are injuries along the way to that. So, you know, we've studied how even an exposure to a single violent event can interfere with startle gaining inhibition as a school-age child. So, they're going to startle, they're not going to be able to attend to learning.
That's right.
So it starts to have a lot of developmental reverberations, not only in illness, but in development.
That's something I keep being impressed with. I'm doing a lot of case consultation supervision these days, and how much people miss that once you get traumatized as a kid, you have a hard time making friends. You have a hard time dating. You have a hard time doing the most ordinary developmental tasks that you have. And what we see in people who we're doing pretty well with at age 25 or 30, they have a lot of things to catch up on. They have never formed friendships. They've never been able to have a satisfactory, intimate relationships. So you start missing an increasing number of things along the way as you desperately try to hold it together after.
And they don't notice their developmental omissions. That's the hard part.
Yeah.
And they have to catch up. So let me give you two quick examples, though, because Bezo knows that I do a lot of work very acutely with children and families. So you see a child right away, just to give you an example of that, what you were talking about, the regulation, little kid who is witnessing a killing in the family. And he says, the 6-year-old who says to you, my heart was beating so fast, I thought it was going to break, and gets frightened by their own physiological response, or then goes on to have a nightmare at night, what we call a stage 4, and wakes up just at a school shooting, and their heart rate's 140. So what happens? They get afraid of going to sleep.
Right.
So these bodily responses have profound effects.
Yeah. Oh, pervasive effects on so many systems. Huh?
I think that allows us to sort of go on to a second area. Yeah.
These are the people we met in medical school. We didn't know that, but we had these patients who had these gigantic charts, who had gone from one surface after another with these mysterious symptoms. And today we know that these are always trauma-based. Huh? But they show.
Well, that leads to my second question to you, Bezo. For everybody that's on this program, I can think of no one in this world who's taught us more what it's like for a youth who's really remains captured by a sense of evil incarnate from his father, having tortured him all through childhood. And you taught me what it's like to be a clinician, to fully appreciate that at that first encounter, that teenager is primed to experiencing you through that same trauma lens. So could you say something about the understanding you bring to that situation to start to help that youth, as you put it, to be able to live in the present and thrive without those awful traumatic expectations, so ready to pounce?
So your brain is an organ of prediction. That's what you have a brain for. How to know what will happen if I get online and interviewed with you. That's what we have brains for, is to predict the future. Because most profoundly entrenched in the first few years of life. And so the input that you get the first few years of life becomes hardwired in your brain. And so children actually become specialists in surviving trauma, in being never go to sleep and always being in the hyper alert and not sitting still because they're always paying attention to who's hurting them. Very helpful while the murder was happening, not helpful when you sit in the classroom. So the challenge is, how do we rewire these kids to let go of the past, probably by acknowledging what happened in part, and to reset our bodies so they can feel safe in the present.
But how do you have that first step? This young man has been tortured, and
Right.
you know that he's experiencing, he can't see you. He wants to be helped. He's there to be helped, but he's still seeing you as potentially evil incarnate as well. You've been able to teach us how to tolerate that response and still set up a working, it's not going to trust you at the first moment. So how you set up a way to start to work with them.
So you start off sort of doing your own work and applying what people like Marco Iacoboni at UCLA have taught us, that when we see somebody being angry, our mirror system gets activated to become angry also. And so when a kid is obnoxious, psychiatrists in their unbelievable wisdom called them oppositional defiant disorder, i.e., this child is a pain in the ass. That means this kid makes me angry. I think psychiatry should move a little bit beyond a diagnostic system like that, where you have diagnosis of.
But you have a great tolerance for the nature of how he's going to see and work with you. They feel from you, so they know they have a space to start to do that work.
So you learn to say the reactions you have to somebody who insults you and hurts you is to go, oh, this kid is very upset. This is not about me, it's about him. And so you sit back and you smile. And when somebody calls you an asshole, you go like, wow, what did he do now? Or, you just make fun of it and you become a different person, oftentimes by being fairly irreverent and by being surprising sometimes, like, wow, where's this guy coming from? What's going on here? And not to be judgmental. Say,
but you also use all those creative strategies that you describe in your book. You'll use what you think is helpful at different points to help someone like that along the way.
Oh yeah, I mean, you start off, as every kindergarten teacher knows, by doing rhythmical activities. You throw a ball back and forth, you move together, you may make some sounds together, you play together. And that's how you calm a kid down. And you start giggling a little bit. You do something that's fun together. And they get a sense of pleasure. Oh, this guy is more flexible than I'm accustomed to. And they find it interesting and challenging.
But you also have a sense of the book communicates a sense that some of these, your patients have continued to work with you or come back to you for years. You have a sense that this is a course. This isn't a single session, a single treatment. This is in order to help somebody to really bridge what's happened to them in that early childhood and such severity. You need to have the patience for the course it's going to take.
Yeah, and it's a journey of recovery. When you read Carl Malanti's book, what it's like to go to war, he has this long book about 15 years of all the different things he had to do to retrieve himself. And I think that's very much what treatment is about. I think these silly treatments where people say, we solve your problems in 8 hours after having been molested for 8 years, that's ridiculous. It takes a long time to retrieve yourself and to readjust yourself to different circumstances.
But you'll look for the entry point. You gave examples of starting with yoga if you needed to, starting with other, and doing narrative at the right point. Or, I mean, it's a way to work with that person that allows them to physiologically start to regulate, to feel emotionally more in self-control, but you'll still work on their selfhood. I mean, it's a complicated process.
It is. And so nobody wants to revisit the misery of their trauma. And so people want to run away from it and not confront it anymore. And so you need to very gently introduce people to the possibility of going back there, but not getting so upset by it in the first place. So the first focus becomes on how do you help yourself to be calm? How do you help yourself to feel safe? And I think things like doing yoga for people who have chronically shut down the relationship to themselves, or to go dancing for people who no longer know how to interact with people, is a very good beginning to get re-engaged with our common human core, basically. And then once people feel safer, you very gently help them to find words for basically unspeakable experiences.
But with some teenagers, we do our trauma history profile. They lay out their life and they look at it for the first time and realize all the things that have happened to them. Realize that they're not a bad kid. They just had a lot of bad things happen that they can start to work on. That's a huge changing point for them.
It's not one or the other. They also make
I understand
bad things, but we shouldn't define them as bad people. But they do bad things. But we need to say
they do sometimes. But they understand now more of the links to what's happened to them in their behavior, including behavior that may be bad. So that is a fundamental way to move forward. So, but some of the kids in your book, Bezo, you describe adults and children who have never known safety. They've never known protection.
Many. Yeah.
Can you say something about? I mean, that's a profound lost experience in childhood.
Yeah, so people need to just be with other people, and the way we do that in the workshops, we learned a lot from taking advanced Shakespeare acting courses. So we know a lot of theater exercises, and we try to get people to move together and to be attuned to each other. And you immediately know who the most traumatized people are, because most traumatized people are uptight and frightened and out of control. So you try to really help people to engage as much as they can, and to slowly discover the pleasure of engagement, the pleasure of just moving together with another person. And so very elementary ways of reconnecting with people, nothing cognitive, nothing fancy. And then slowly you get into just saying something about yourself, and learning to listen to other people also, and really hear, oh, that was your experience. My experience was different.
But they may challenge you to see if you really will be a protective person, because they've not really known it. You and I talked the other day, and I pointed out that 2005 finding from Candale's group, I think Rogan, that achieving safety and addressing danger and safety are different. Danger, you give an animal a chance to do something where they won't get shocked, something that protects them. It's not only that their fear goes down, but the actual reward center light up. And so these children have never known the reward of feeling safe. And shouldn't surprise any of us, as you point out in your book, that there's an enormous amount of substance abuse, because those are the same reward centers that they had a deficit in achieving safety as a child.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think our field should pay much more attention to sources of pleasure and how to enhance sources of pleasure. Is indeed, the people we work with are deeply hurt and joyless people and frightened people. Kindergarten teachers should be our teachers, because they know how to work with frightened kids by playing games with them and making them feel better about themselves. Psychologists, psychiatrists are very poor at making people feel good about themselves.
Well, that's why I gave you the example. Looking at fear and its reduction isn't the same. A little kid gets lost from her mother or his mother, and finds her. He not only feels less fear, but he feels elated.
That's right.
And that elation is something that many of the people that we treat have really never known. That's an important part of life.
Yeah.
To be able to regain that.
And what I'm really advocating is that people need to have experiences of what that feels like.
Right. I agree.
One of my favorite, actually my favorite treatment in terms of giving it, is psychodrama, where people can sort of do things that, oh, that's what it would have felt like if my mom would have helped me when I was 3 years old. Oh, that's what it feels like to do this with people, because they're not familiar with these experiences of what it's like to.
Well, you allow them to be the ideal person. You allow them to see what it would like to be protected in those psychodramas. Right. Sometimes.
Exactly.
You allow them to imagine protective interventions that they had never imagined before.
Yeah. But see, and I'm not the person who does it to them. I'm just a stage director, but other members of the group provided with those experiences, so it doesn't all come out on me, but somebody.
I understand.
But it's very important that as a therapist, you feel I need to do everything, but when you do psychodrama, people can do it for each other.
But they can write different endings. They can give themselves. They can do revenge safely. I mean, all the things that weren't possible at the time. It's a wide range of responses that you can do.
I've people volunteer to be people who get beaten up after a rape, or people who get killed after molestation, and people volunteer the time for it. Very satisfying for people who have been raped.
Well, partly because during the time of the event, as I see them acutely, they want to do certain things, but they know it's not safe to do them. They got to suppress them, or it's going to be worse. So having a place where they can express that. We saw kids after their mother's rape who witnessed it. Years ago we described that, and it was hard because they sometimes identified with the police, with the mother, but with the rapist, because they wanted to be on the safe side of things. It's hard because you got to work it out, and we have to be able to do that with children and adults. So let them work through those feelings.
It's a huge issue, and that's important for us to acknowledge that if the guy who was the drunkest, most violent person got away with what he did, then I would like to grow up to be a drunk and violent person because nobody will hurt me. So I'm going to behave more like that person. And it's really important for people who treat these kids to know how they have had no other examples besides people who win by violence. And we need to provide them with other physical examples of how you can do differently, not abstractly, but in terms of action.
Well, I think that brings us to, because you're bringing up the societal importance of this field. So it really brings us to the fact that you and I have both been privileged to help build the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. You know, it's now 140. Can you imagine federally funded sites? We started with 17. That the mission is to increase, for those who don't know, the access and improve the standard of care for traumatized children and families across the United States. But you were one of a small group that had the vision for this network. I mean, you had the early vision before it ever existed. So maybe you can say something about how you considered its social importance, given the enormity of the problem, not just the individuals we're talking about, but the collective. And then it kept critical choice to keep development at the front and center rather than diagnosis.
Absolutely. So it really came from that people called me and said, could you do some research on the effect of trauma learning or peer relationships? And I said, that work has been done. And what became very obvious is that clinicians did not learn about child development and did not learn what Dante Cicchetti and Frank Putnam had been researching, because we know a lot about development. And that basically, because of cultural reasons, the perception of trauma became the Veterans Administration perception of a particular event happened to you after you were a perfectly healthy person, because that's the culture of the VA, that particular wartime experience really destroyed you. It's not how it goes, because it's really a developmental issue, and trauma has a very different impact on brain and mind development depending on what age it occurs in. Dante Cicchetti was the first person to point that out.
You saw that we needed, you early, long before I was engaged in this, saw the need for a really socially committed program in the United States.
Well, it all depends on where you are. You know, our hospital was in the inner city of Boston. My close friends were good friends with John Bowlby, so I got to meet the early attachment researchers, and I really very early understood how vast numbers of our patients were abused within their families at a very early age. And so our first subjects became small children to really look at how their abuse had impacted their mental development, basically. And then we started to look at the brain, and then Marty Teicher really went off with how trauma affects the brain development, which became a very rich.
But you knew that this couldn't be just mental health. It had involved schools, it had about pediatrics, it had about juvenile justice, had about military families. You couldn't just be the old-fashioned clinic in an academic center. And you had, along with this group that you started with, already the concept of something much broader.
But but that was the culture in those days. The culture changes dramatically, and so when JFK became president, he had the Community Mental Health Acts. My first job after my residency was the last superintendent of Boston State Hospital, a once venerated sanitarium, madhouse basically, and all these people went into the community, and so I knew something about all these people who are very disabled for a variety of reasons, and it was about the community. Gerald Kaplan's office, and the founder of community psychiatry, was down the hall for me, because that was the culture we were living in. And then the culture changed into an individual model and no longer a community model, but that's a political issue. And the cultural issue was not really that people changed, but the culture changed.
Well, and I think that, we both can be proud that the network has come as far as it can. Maybe I can give everybody an example of what the change. So when we started, and you had seen this coming when you were talking about the abused children, that the child welfare agencies were getting lots of child psychiatry trainings on contracts. We looked at them. They were all about anxiety disorders, depression, ADHD. We looked at each other and said, well, but all these kids are there because they were neglected and abused. And nobody's teaching, nobody's addressing that.
That's right.
So we now have a child welfare toolkit, that Charlie Wilson and people experts put together early that said to child welfare workers, well, you can take this big file, but let's look at their attachment difficulties. Let's look at their sleep disturbances. Look at this. And then we can make better judgments about where they should get care and what kind of care. And then we could, as a network, train people in the community to give better care. But when we started off, our field was a very strong example of how society was ignoring the very issue for which the kids were in the system in the first place.
The way it started was that when I was a medical student, I studied with Bruno Bettelheim, and he blamed autism on refrigerator mothers.
Right.
And schizophrenia was blamed on double-blind parents. And so everything was blamed on the parents. And the parents went into revolt. And they went to Congress and said, we don't want to be blamed for our kids' mental illness. And they started NAMI, the National Association for Mentally Ill, and said, have psychiatrists no longer blame their parents, which was a very solid point of view. And so NIH could no longer, because of the senator from New Mexico was involved, could no longer developmental outcome studies where the parents were involved. We could no longer into looking at environmental issues as antecedents of mental illness. So the field went entirely the opposite direction. And we went into genes and chemistry and all that stuff, explaining everything. And that's sort of when the NCTSN came online, like, but maybe it has something to do with the parents. But hopefully we're not going to do the same thing as we did 50 years ago, to blame everything on the parents, but to know that there is such a thing as intergenerational transmission of violence. And if you were abused and neglected as a kid, you're going to have great trouble taking good care of your kids. And so it's not because you're a bad person, it's because you don't have the experience to do well with these kids. So we need to have home visitation programs, the single most effective treatment in all of psychiatry, home visitation program for young mothers, to help people to do that.
So that's an example. Danny Schachter years ago has a mother and a child in an observation, and she leaves the room as part of the schedule. Right. They're videoing this, and the child starts to have troubles. Right. And she essentially gets angry at the child for misbehaving. And then they show her the video, self-reflection. They show her what happened, and it suddenly realizes that this child is afraid. And then she starts to remember how afraid she was in an abusive, violent family. And she suddenly starts to see her child differently. And it makes all the difference in the world.
Right. And so we need to treat the systems. And these kids are not little creatures of their own. Or as Bowlby said, what cannot be told to the mother cannot be told to the self. And these are all systemic issues. Children are part of their social environment, and we need to pay attention to everybody. And the danger usually emanates from their own environment. And so we need to help that environment to become safer.
Even in good relationships, we both know Alicia Lieberman and highly respect her, but her parent-child psychotherapy for little preschool children, where there's been domestic violence and somebody's been separated out of the family, she does work with the mother and preschool child, unbelievably rich work. But it's all about relationship. It's the fact that the violence has even caused estrangements between the 3-year-old and the mother, because the mother took a knife to try to protect herself, and now the kid feels afraid of the mother. But they get to that point, and they actually help correct that between mother and child, and without any treatment of the PTSD symptoms, which they measure, the PTSD symptoms come down. And those children whose IQs have been lowered by the violence goes up. Yeah. So your idea of focusing on that relationship recovery.
Oh, absolutely. And then you run into the problem sometimes that parents are too impaired to actually to benefit from that. And then you need to supplement it somehow.
So I will make a pitch for people that they can go to learn.nctsn.org. Lieberman has an attachment vitamins course. They may, along with all our other learning, that's it, learn.nctsn.org. I think people will find some really helpful things that reinforce the kind of points you make in your book as programs. So, let me ask you the troubling question for some, and that's that we've done this work for a long time, and we know that psychiatry, child psychiatry, maybe more than some. That was the trouble with the trauma developmental disorder, has trouble taking into account the depth and seriousness of these experiences. They always edge towards it and retreat. Easier to call it a disorder like PTSD, which we both know is an important disorder and gives scientific legacy to the voice to children's distress. But what do you think that's all about? Why is it so hard to really take in, like your book describes, the full depth and importance and implications of what are the centrality of human experience, these principles?
I totally don't get it, actually. Before COVID, I taught this course together with Maria Soja and Carla Lyons-Ruth and Marty Teicher for the Harvard child psychiatrists. And this was their favorite course, was about trauma and development, basically. It was a very good course. So same thing here, where right now in the Berkshires, the crew I work with are very developmentally oriented. I don't get it, how you want to be a psychiatrist and just give pills to people. They don't work. For me, I'm just baffled by it.
They get lots of overdiagnoses and over-medication, you point out in your book.
And let's be frank about it. The DSM is completely not a scientific instrument. Nobody who is really serious about stuff believes that any of these diagnoses really exist. They're a list of symptoms. That's what it said with the opening of the DSM-3 when it first came out. This is just a list of symptoms. This is too inaccurate to ever be used for insurance or forensic purposes. That preamble disappeared from DSM-4, DSM-5.
Well, it allows us to organize a set of concepts. I mean, it can be used very productively.
It can be, but maybe it gets used more often unproductively.
Well, the example I give is ADHD. We did a study where kids were exposed to a school shooting, and it was very well controlled. And we could see the kids with the highest exposure, and those who had previous ADHD were even worse. But they met the Connors criteria in a school. But they got better, and that went better with treatment. And the major thing we saw that led to learning disorders and problems was sleep disturbance coming after the violence. Nobody was sleeping. How could they learn? Adults don't learn when they haven't slept. So why is that ignored in the discussion?
Don't ask me of somebody who doesn't ignore it.
But it is a chronic issue for us, don't you think?
What's interesting is that the guy who was in charge of the personality disorders for the DSM-5 came to visit me after. He was an old student of mine, a wonderful guy, Wolfson, in Cincinnati. And he said, I had the personality disorders, and then I read in your book about developmental trauma and that you did these field trials, and I never heard about developmental field. The personality disorder people didn't even hear about our proposal.
That's not quite true, because I was engaged in that, and the personality people wanted a development. They liked it. They saw it as relevant.
Yeah.
And it was just that it was in the more traditional channels, especially child psychiatry. But the personality people understood that there could be fundamental changes. Yeah. As Freud knew. Freud used to say, trauma is taken up under the ego silently and then presents itself. Yeah. So I agree with you, but we're seeing the opposite happen as well, which is, you told me that, NCTSN was in the front of promoting the findings of the classic adverse childhood experiences and the severe impact on dimensions of health and mental health. We promoted those findings. Yeah. And now you have reservations like I do that ACE scores are wanting to be used to screen children universally and schools and in pediatrics without any attention to the distress of the child, which may vary tremendously.
Yeah. So this is the issue. That Felitti study was an epidemiological study. It was extremely good to bring things into focus that all of us had seen in various ways in various studies. But here was a gigantic study of 25,000 people, and they showed the distribution and how the more traumatized you are, the more of a whole range of disorders you had. Incredibly important study.
I think it's a 55% variable risk for depression.
Oh,
It
yes.
was high.
Oh, and drug abuse and child abuse have a 4,600% correlation, that sort of stuff, like very important study. And then it took a long time before people started to read it. The study came out in 1999. I said it's 22 years ago. And just in the past 5 years or so, people are beginning to really look at it more seriously, but it took a long time. And then, as always happens, people may, to my mind, misapply it, in that we see huge numbers of traumatized kids in every school in America, particularly poorer areas, and these kids are out of control. And we need to understand how traumatized they are in order to get classrooms in which these kids can learn, where they actually are helped with emotion regulation. The effort by Nadine Burke-Harris, who I think is a wonderful person and smart and amazing, but her idea of collecting ACE scores on every kid, I'm very worried about. Because an ACE score, we know what that means for actuarial reasons, that if you have been an ACE score of 5, the likelihood you will flunk out of school, likelihood you will get medically ill, the likelihood that you become a drug addict, et cetera, goes way up. So it's a dangerous thing to have in your records.
But it's also that it doesn't stop at 4. The more you have, the worse the impairments. But also, it doesn't allow you to plan for a referral properly. Even the physiological, the diseases like cardiovascular disease are not based on number of events. It turns out the distress level that keeps up all those body changes. You can measure that. You can see who's at higher risk. And we're now learning that you can change that by intervention, even psychological interventions in the type that you described. But you've got to know the distress of the child as well. And it's not hard to do that. There are places like Intermountain West, Brooks Keeshon, who's doing distress and distributes between child welfare and pediatrics, and doing it in a more scientific kind of way. So no one's against doing something, but it should be done with a way that you can properly refer children and know they can get good care.
Well, the issue of referrals is interesting. I met just before the pandemic with all the school principals in the county that I'm in right now, in Western Massachusetts. And they said, they had heard me do a presentation. They said, Dr. Van der Kolk, we'd love you to set up a clinic for traumatized kids. And I asked them, so how many of your kids in the schools in my county have parents who are alcoholics, drug addicts? How many overdoses have they seen, et cetera, et cetera? And the school principal said, probably about half of our kids. And I said, in that case, you don't need a clinic. Whether you like it or not, you need to have a school that becomes a trauma healing place. And the teachers who did not really want to be social workers have no choice but to run classrooms in which they do active trauma intervention type stuff.
Because they're committed to the children and they want to see the best for them. They know that that's such an interference.
But you cannot farm it out. It needs to be right in the school. So I'm trying to get neurofeedback programs going in every school that I have anything to do with, to calm the brains down, to do computer brain interface games, so you can focus your mind, you can focus your brain. I'm very an advocate of starting every day with yoga in every classroom, ending each day with singing together in the classroom, that feeling of pleasure, of joy, of connection, and calming your physiology down in connection with other kids. That's where you start.
I understand. Your book makes clear, you make very clear all those starting points that people ignore. But I have to tell you, Bezo, I'm going to do something unusual. You deserve a This Is Your Life moment. So I've arranged for a special guest to join us.
Oh.
So we're going to do that right now. Hopefully it works.
All right.
So this is your, there you are.
I thought it might be Alexander.
I thought, you should get some reward and pleasure from this besides talking to me.
That's the reward.
We've been joined for everybody on this program by Alexander McFarlane from Adelaide, Australia. And Sandy is a most special friend of and colleague of Bezel's. And you can know that if you read his book, Bezel's book. But Dr. McFarlane's an international leader in emergency psychiatry, disaster mental health, military psychiatry. But in our trauma field, he conducted the pioneering longitudinal study of children and families after the 1980s catastrophic Australian bushfire. But I must say, Bezo, I also had him to join us because we needed to be joined by someone who has more professional publications than you and me combined.
True.
So
I
I
also
figured that
call
was
him-
a good person to invite.
I also call him the smartest guy I know.
Okay, well, he's going to get to ask you a few questions beyond me.
Oh dear. Well, look, Bob, look, it's such a pleasure to be asked to be part of this conversation, and it's just wonderful to sit back and hear the wisdom that the both of you, who really are true pioneers in this field, have been sharing. And look, thank you both so much for what you've done and given the field. But Bezel, actually, what I was wanting to do here was to just sort of take the conversation in a slightly different direction, because one of the things I loved about The Body Keeps the Score is that you really captured the excitement of your journey through the trauma field. And also provide sort of wonderful insights. And you're a bit like a bowerbird who's collected these wonderful insights along the way. But we're now 41 years into that journey after PTSD got included in DSM-3. And what I'd like you to do is to sort of think back to where the journey began. And are we at a place now that you anticipated, or are there surprises and disappointments?
Well, I love it. It's part of the reason why it's so good friends, because we have this historical vision. And now that life has gone on, we knew each other when we were boys, and now we're old men. And so we have seen things change. And when you look at how PTSD came on the map, it was fascinating. A bunch of us are working at the VA with soldiers our age, and we see that they have collapsed and have become dysfunctional. And it was really the passion of young people like us at the time that got PTSD on the map. And how do we define it? As an extraordinary event outside the realm of usual human experience. How out of lunch could we have been? And we had not a clue about how much domestic violence there is, how much child abuse. That was completely off the map. How can psychiatry have been blind until 1980 to even begin to look at the pervasive issue of violence in all of our societies and all of our families? And another important thing happened, and that's, to my mind, and we can argue about it, is that because the VA is so powerful in America, and because America is such a gigantic land that's still on war footing, basically, even though there's no war going on, we have this gigantic army that goes abroad. And so a lot of resources go into the military in America. And so how did the military define disabilities if a particular event happened to you? And so the PTSD diagnosis became a memory diagnosis of, this has to do with what happened to you on that particular moment in Vietnam. That's a political decision, because that is not what we saw. What we saw is people who said, I've become a monster. Nobody is safe with me. I cannot have loving feelings. The only people I love were my soldiers who died in the battlefield. And I also have nightmares and flashbacks about the events. But it was much deeper than just that memory. And because of the VA culture, where you get compensation for that memory, that the notion that PTSD is a memory diagnosis has become sort of codified. I think it's a terrible mistake. As you and I, certainly Sandy and I have talked plenty about it, we know that trauma changes your brain and your orientation and your whole perception of current reality. And that's a dimension that we have chronically not really paid attention to. I see something beginning to be paid attention to actually in the past year, that people are beginning to move away from a little bit from that reconsolidation of that bad memory or something into, no, it changes who you are in a very profound way.
I mean, do you think that, well, looking back, that we should have got further? I mean, do you find that we're making the same mistakes over and over and over again, or we're being captured by the wrong arguments? I mean, are you surprised? Are you surprised where we are?
I'm disappointed. I'm not surprised, and because you and I talk about it a lot also, is how the reality of our world is a political reality. And the scientific reality has almost no relationship to the political reality. At the end, everything is played out in politics. And that's true for the politics of National Child Traumatic Stress Network or whatever funding of NIH that determines what we can look at and what we can do. Do I wish we were somewhere else? Yes, I do. But I've also come to understand that if you ignore politics, you cannot get anywhere.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting reform because one of the criticisms of PTSD at the beginning was that it was a political diagnosis. It was to recognise the predicament of the Vietnam veterans, the victims of domestic violence, the Holocaust survivors. But in one sense, this is a field that is intensely political, and to ignore that, is at our peril. So I mean, it's interesting what you say. That I mean, I guess, but psychiatry is not very good at politics, is it?
Well, they're very good in sucking up to the drug companies, they're very good in politics. In America,
but it's very hard for them psychiatry to take into effect the profundity of the developmental impact. The smallest example I can give is that in DSM-5, we proposed in the text or in the impairment section to add to occupational and interpersonal or schooling, to add the word developmental impairment. And we were shot down because then they'd have to use it in every diagnosis. And we're saying, well, but the developmental impairments are critical. How can you not include that word? So I'm just giving that as another example of where we kind of lose out on the depth of what we know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go on, Bill.
Back to but Bob and I started, there was a big emphasis on community psychiatry at some point, that the problems were embedded in the culture that people live in. That disappeared. And if you really pay attention very seriously to the developmental trauma, that means you have to intervene or pay attention to the context that people live in. And psychiatry is very shy to do anything like that right now. You rather talk about DNA and about cytokines than they talk about reality.
And I guess that really brings me to the next question, Basil, because we've been talking about looking back. What about looking forwards? Because one of the intriguing things about the trauma field is that it's sort of come and gone in cycles. And what do you really think are the risks for us going forward? And there are a number of things I'd like you to address, but one of them is about the introduction of psychedelics, which are obviously a new horizon in this field. But just generally speaking, I mean, what are your fears for the field going forward and the risks that we really need to think through?
But the number one issue, I think, is the issue of evidence-based treatments. And all three of us are as much in favor of evidence as anybody could possibly be. But what happened in our field is that a few people got money to study the most simplistic of treatments. And then when they're done that, they said, we have found a treatment of choice for PTSD. And then those early ventures into beginning to understand how to treat trauma got codified prematurely into we have an evidence-based treatment, shutting to a large degree the door on true exploration of treatments. And so I submit funding all the time to NIH like a fool, and it comes back and said, why would you do this treatment? We already know how to treat traumatized kids. You treat them with CBT. They go, yeah, about 80% don't quite make it. But you can't argue with your viewers. And
we'll point out, Basil, there are no longitudinal studies. We don't know you treat a child at 7, how it affects, as you point out in the Frank Putnam, we don't know what affects their dating when they're 18 or their marriage when they're 20 or they're 30 or whatever. They're professionals. So we don't actually know the real developmental outcomes.
No, it doesn't. There are a bunch of good studies. There's the Minnesota longitudinal study is a very good study. Carl Lyons Ruth, Frank Putnam, there's three come to my mind of very good longitudinal studies that are multidimensional, but people don't know those studies.
But we don't know if these interventions early on change that or not at this point.
That's the other thing that we should learn about. And what sort of interventions? Is it going camping with the Boy Scouts, or is it talking about your trauma?
Well, and I guess what you're highlighting as well, Basil, is that one of the real tragedies about the treatment outcome literature is that most of them have very short follow-up periods where the effect sizes are judged. And, even in adults, if you looked at these people 3 years later. I mean, what is the stability of that improvement?
Right.
But so what about?
So what you look at is a very narrow dimension. They look at PTSD core diagnoses. But for example, I'm just finishing up our paper on psychedelics and its effect on self-compassion. Really getting to appreciate who you are is extremely hard to treat. Alexithymia, people who don't know what they're feeling, who just do all acting out, that doesn't get measured. People just measure, do you have intrusive recollections and hyperarousal? But there's all these other dimensions underneath that, which you know as well as anybody, that we don't measure most of the time in the treatment outcome. That may be more pernicious actually in the long range.
So obviously one of the risks is premature closure. What other risks do you sort of worry about with the field into the future?
Well, again, it is, there's a pervasive problem has always been present in our field, that we tend to be a very religious field. And people say, I'm a follower of Freud. Oh, I'm a follower of Jung. Oh, I'm a follower of so-and-so. Rather than saying, I'm trying to treat my patients the best I can. In our field, people divide themselves up into camps where they follow a particular technique or a particular leader. And you have these warring camps with each other where people don't focus on what's the best outcome for this person, but what technique can I get the most money for, or something like that. Our attitude is very unscientific in terms of outcome.
Yeah, and actually, I think it's a very interesting reflection, because for the younger people in the audience, at the beginning, I think our field was very unified, and it was a struggle to survive, and it didn't matter what therapeutic school you came from. There was a real sense of a shared purpose.
Yeah.
But I think once, actually, it was really around the first treatment guidelines that the ISTSS published, it really led to a real fracture between the CBT therapist and the EMDR therapist, and which I think did a great disservice to the field, and that's 20 years ago now. And obviously a new field, Basil, is the one that you've just mentioned about psychedelics. I mean, what do you think the risks with psychedelics and their role in PTSD?
Again, it is, what we see in psychedelics right now is much what we saw with trauma back when it started, is that everybody loves each other. People like each other's method. The psilocybin people are not fighting with the MDMA people, with the ketamine. They're also, because there's no money in there yet. The first NIH grants just came out for psychedelic, went to Hopkins for psilocybin for chronic depression, I believe. But once money becomes at play, people start going up in their own camps. And I think the lack of focus on outcome and really looking at the complexity of what we're treating, to not only look at PTSD, but really also look at affect regulation capacities, attentional capacities, executive functioning. These should all be measures that we do in every treatment outcome studies, and not confine ourselves to just the core PTSD symptoms. What I'd like to say is John McCain probably had the same PTSD score as the homeless person down the street from me lying in the gutter. And so PTSD measures only a small part of the whole constellation of troubles that people suffer from.
But Sandy, don't you think that other fields of medicine move into second, third, fourth generations of dimensions and treatment approaches? And we've kind of gotten stuck. People don't want to move into they don't want to take a step back and start to look at what should be improved ways of looking at it, with theories that don't evolve biological theories from the 60s, like fear structuring, and start to look at, we kind of get reified that way. And there's a great, for those who are younger in the audience, there's a great room to start to really move. I can see that in our network, thinking about pushing people to think of new generations of interventions that address the complexity of issues that Basil just mentioned. It's hard to get people to do, but medicine does, other fields do that. We need to be good at doing that too.
Yeah, actually, I think that's a really important point, Bob, because I think one of the things I found fascinating going around sort of interviewing the founders of the trauma field is that when people first came to this field, there was an extraordinary openness, and a great deal of time was spent around collecting phenomenology and really trying to sort of understand the multiple dimensions that you've both been talking about. But then they got put into scales and measurements. And it's almost like people have forgotten that those scales perhaps have significant limitations. And, you know, it's almost like the 2.5 decades of neuroscience that have really blossomed in this field have had minimal impact on clinical treatment. And as you say, Bob, that just wouldn't happen in medicine generally. I mean, I think it's extraordinary that we have become so sort of polarized into these little treatment schools that we've lost that broad vision. And I think that really is a huge challenge. And I don't know if either of you have got any thoughts about how we can help.
You know, the National Network started a program on the core curriculum using in-depth cases, your group. And the point of that was that we had all these people doing protocol treatments, and we had all these master clinicians who had extraordinary understanding of children's experiences and how to work with them. And they were being left out. I mean, we needed to gather the wisdom of those clinicians. What happens when we get together? We talk science, sure, but we actually teach each other, as Bezo says, of what we've learned from a patient that we've seen about a new circumstance, an experience that gave us a new understanding.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at scientific programs, there's no room for those new understandings any longer that come out of actually an expanded experience. That's why I think Bezo's book has had such a profound reception, because every page is inviting someone to a newer, an expanded understanding. And I don't know, we try with the core curriculum, but the people, it's hard because people running protocols don't know how to marry themselves always to a core curriculum that's dealing to expand the really basic understanding of the child's experience. We're getting better at it, but it is a challenge.
But actually, I think that's a great point, Bob, because I think what you're really capturing is that we've really lost the wisdom of the case study and the rich narrative that you can develop around individual cases. And I think, you know, one of the reasons that's probably happened is that computing has come to really dominate the way we organise and collect information. So it's a bit like you can't ever publish a case study now. But I mean, it's interesting. We've just got a Royal Commission in Australia into the suicide of veterans and military personnel. And it's interesting that the Commission, I think, has really recognised there are two ways you need to look at this. One way is to look at what the scientific literature says, but the other way is to look at the actual cases and see why this person has died. And it's never as simple and unidimensional as you'll get out of a scientific paper.
So I was raised by Ed Schneidman, a previous professor at UCLA, who invented the psychological autopsy along with his colleagues for suicide. But I heard him. These were sadly but rich, detailed understanding of the suicidal circumstances and the degree of pain that the person felt. And you needed to do that. You were losing that side of it.
So I think Sandy is making a very important point. So that our field, every field of medicine is always really should be at the basis of people's subjective experiences. That was the experience that people were treating. And that has disappeared in psychiatry. For example, you asked about psychedelics. And so you can get funded right now to study the effect of psychedelics on dopamine receptors, but you cannot study the effect of psychedelics on behavior. So what we're finding in our study, for example, the thing I'm almost finished with now, is that alexithymia. If you have alexithymia, you overreact to everything, and you don't react to your trauma anything more than to anything else, because you're living in an internal soup where you don't know what's going on with you. And then we find that on MDMA, there's a dramatic improvement in alexithymia, that people actually get to know themselves. There is no serotonin receptor or cytokine that can measure that, but we need to go back to studying mental processes. I haven't seen a paper about mental processes for 20 years in the psychiatric literature. That's what we study for a living.
Look, because then I think that's one of the things that's so good about your book, Bezel, is that you write it like a case history. And it's, you know, the case history in a sense of your professional development.
But that's
And,
what
you
you
know,
and I have always done, Sandy. When you and I write together, we always talk about our cases, and then we write whatever we're writing. Huh?
Well, let me give you an example. We published 30 years ago a paper on children who witnessed their mother's rape. These are young children to teenagers. And we were very explicit in the case. We had measurements, so we could show that they were having as much PTSD as they'd been sexually assaulted themselves, for that matter. But we gave very detailed descriptions of their experiences. I always remember the editor of the Journal of the Academy of Child Psychiatry said, "We never publish such detailed," they were difficult, but you know, we think it's necessary. But I don't think today that would happen.
No, couldn't be done. But that needs to come back. It's critical. If we want to regain the soul of psychiatry, we need to talk about the cases.
actually,
And it
I
means
think-
regaining life experience as central, as causative, not as just some modifier in life. But that's what your book is, as causative, because then you've got to understand the life experience.
And Bob, getting back to your question about why is psychiatry different from medicine, I think, you know, we've been talking about how, you know, we have these individual schools of therapy. So the last thing that people ever do is talk about their failures. They always talk about their successes. And, you know, one of the things that I really enjoy about our conversations together is we always talk about our failures, and the failures really are the cases where you learn. And I think the issues in general medicine is that you have to face your failures, and that's where your real developments in treatment come from. You know, treatment guidelines don't help you with that, and it's actually admitting that those failures exist and really trying to think through the mechanisms and the processes that might lead to the next advance is really where we learn.
Let me ask you a question. My main training when I was a medical student and resident was the M&M conference, the Morbidity and Mortality Conference. I hear that hospitals don't have morbidity and mortality conference anymore. Is that true? I mean, that was the core of my training throughout medicine. Talking about your failures.
Actually, Basil, just explain for the younger people what they were, because I thought they were pretty
You talk
gruesome.
about that you expect certain things to happen, and they didn't happen. And you go back and you do postmortems to say, where did we go wrong? What assumptions did we make that weren't right? How could we have done it differently? Could we have done it differently? Could anybody else could have done it differently? And that's how we should function.
Yeah, and see, I think that they don't happen anymore. And one of the reasons is because there are questions around the legal privilege of those meetings. That if you know, a surgeon was criticised by another surgeon for some step that was taken in the treatment of the patient, that could then be used in the prosecution of negligence against that surgeon. So it's almost like people can no longer really properly discuss failure. And it's almost like I think the world has become, you know, driven by advertising rather than actual honesty and proper self-reflection. And so that I think that's one of the real challenges that we have is, you know, how do we have proper debate and proper acknowledgement of our difficulties? So, you know, where do we introduce these new treatments? It's where we have failed in the treatments, the first line treatments, but we've got to acknowledge what those are.
I think that also includes when you have patients, quote, who don't complete a treatment or don't even enter. So it's just a statistic as opposed to, we did a study with adolescents. We went back and said, who didn't join the group? I mean, we went and looked at them. And so what do you find? You find the adolescent who had his brother killed in a horrible accident, doesn't want to join the group because he knows he's going to bring that home to his mother and his mother will get worse.
Yeah.
Or the boy who was a driver of a car and his girlfriend was killed and he goes to the funeral and the father of the girl won't even shake his hand, won't say hello to him. So those are the two not coming to the group. But look at what you learn from that.
Yeah.
They're not just a statistic. And I think we have to recapture that. Anyway, we're gonna be closing up in a couple of minutes, but for everybody listening in, the three of us have done these kinds of conversations in how many places in the world?
On every
And it's
continent
been,
except for Antarctica.
thank you, Sandy, for joining us. It's a pleasure for the three of us to be together on the quote same stage. And people get a sense of how rewarding a life in this field can be, despite the frustrations and the struggles that we've always encountered
Can you say something?
along the
You know,
way.
People ask me, what's the motivation behind your book? The motivation was that I was on various admissions committee at Harvard and at BU about residence applicants. And I always ask people, what books have you read that have inspired you to become a psychiatrist? And about 15 years ago, people stopped being able to come up with books of what they had read. They would say, the DSM. I said, really? And there were so many books I read as a young person that really inspired me, like I Never Promised You, Rose Garden, Man's Search for Meaning, and stuff like that. And I thought, I'm going to write a book that if you're an undergraduate and you read it, like this is the most damn interesting thing I could spend in my life on.
Well, you provided a lot of inspiration, so thank you.
Yes, thank you, Basil. You have.
And I would like to thank all of you, Dr. Vanderkoop, Dr. Pijnus, Dr. McFarland. We truly have the international trifecta of trauma experts here with us this evening. Thank you for this fascinating and stimulating conversation and the privilege and opportunity to learn from you. We're honored and grateful. I also want to thank our sponsors for today's program, Edie Parker and the Davidson Hooker Family Foundation. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, for your generous support of our Open Mind programs. We look forward to seeing you back on January 6, 2022 for our first Open Mind program of the year. We'll welcome Dr. Wendy Suzuki, who's the world-renowned NYU neuroscientist and author of Happy Brain, Happy Life, and her new book, Good Anxiety. We wish you and your families a healthy and meaningful new year. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you to our trifecta of experts.